talking dogs tell archaeology for the 21st century.
Thank you. And again, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be here. I'm reminded as I begin this talk, many years ago, I was being interviewed for a position as the archaeologist for the province of Alberta, Canada. And as part of that interview, I met with the director of Alberta Culture, who was a sociologist. And part of the job was going to be to develop an interpretive program for a major archaeological site. And so she asked me, well, what would you do? How would you develop this program? And I said, well, I would start out with an exhibit about how archaeologists learn about the past, about archaeological methods. And she stopped me immediately. She says, you know, what is it with you archaeologists? Everyone I've talked to about this job starts with a presentation on archaeological method. And I think what this speaks to is this general fascination about how do we make the past speak? How do we work without records and make the past talk? And in recent years, let's see if I can get this to work. Probably pressing the wrong button. There we go. In recent years, we have, archaeology is really, at least in the United States, but I think also here in Europe, has really become enamored with toys. Drones, LiDAR, GPS, 3D scanning, DNA analysis. We really like our toys. And these toys have allowed us to learn a lot more about the past, make the past speak more. And, but I think that there's a problem with that. Now, first of all, I want to make clear I like the toys also. Having used a drone in the last 2 long seasons of excavation, how did we ever excavate without these things? My point is that in many ways, and this emphasis we have on how we learn about the past, in many ways, this is kind of like a talking dog. And there is a fundamental problem with a talking dog. And that problem is that what's interesting about a talking dog is that the dog can talk, not what the dog has to say. And so I think we have to really, keep our toys, but we really have to address how do we say something meaningful in the world? How do we give the dog something to say that has impact on people? And, oops, yeah. So how do we get the dog to talk and say something that has impact on people? And I think the answer to that lies in, I don't know what I'm doing here. Now I'm going the wrong way. I'm an archaeologist, I should be able to recognize the U-swear on this device and see that which button to push. Anyway, I think we have to ask archaeology for whom? For whom are we doing archaeology? Who is our audience? Who are we trying to address with this audience? And in doing that, I think we have to go beyond talking about archaeologists, talking to archaeologists. Now, I come from a very different perspective than probably all of you, in that I was trained in archaeology in the Americas, and by the Americas I mean North and South America, not simply the United States. And in the Americas, archaeology is not part of history. It's not its own discipline. It is part of a 4-field anthropology. An anthropology that studies linguistics, that studies cultural anthropology, ethnography, that includes biological anthropology. And I find that a very useful way to look at it and to try to make the dog speak and say something, and I'll elaborate on that. Also, I want to say that I think that many of us have learned how to do this, and Alfredo's talk, I think, points to many things where that has been done. But I think there are a number of things we need to take into account in terms of having something meaningful to say. First of all, I think we need to adapt a pragmatic epistemology. In other words, an epistemology that makes no a priori assumptions about what is the use of archaeology or what is the utility of archaeology for contemporary life. But we need to find the relevance or utility of our research in social struggle and social change. We need to start with the world's problems as they come to us rather than focusing on the discipline's traditional structure. The acid test of our ideas should be in the court of public and pragmatic effectiveness, focused not on theory, methods, and concepts, but on audience and what we have to say. I also think that we need to embrace a notion of praxis. And by praxis here, I don't mean just how we behave in the world, but the way I see praxis is something that has three parts. First of all is knowing the world. Second of all is critiquing the world, and of course that means critiquing ourselves also. And finally, taking action in the world. In archaeology, again, we're very good at knowing the world. We've spent, well here, 100 years. We're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the institution we're visiting, or I'm visiting. And we really know how to do that well. And there's been quite a bit of development on how to do critique, both to critique our position in the world, why we say what we do and whatnot. But where we've not seen a lot of work is in terms of action. By the same token, I think we should see archaeology as a craft. And by seeing archaeology as a craft, this is an idea that Michael Shanks and I advanced over 20 years ago. But by seeing archaeology as a craft, I'm talking specifically in reference to something that was called the arts and crafts movement in the United States and Great Britain. And this was a movement, the idea that what we do in the world should be a unity of hands, minds, and hearts. That it should incorporate all of those things, so that there should not be a break between the theory of archaeology and the science of archaeology, for example, such as we see very strongly in Great Britain today. Less strongly in the United States. I would have no idea about Germany or Russia. But in Great Britain, there's a very strong divide between archaeologists that talk about theory and archaeologists that do science. We need to get rid of that. And we need to see it as a unified thing. And again, as I said when I began, I'm trained as an anthropologist, and I think anthropology brings some useful things to what we're trying to do. The first of these is holism, the idea that of all sciences, anthropology alone sees humans as biological, social, cultural, speaking, and being rooted in a primate lineage. It alone sees the range of human experience from hunters-gatherers to corporations, from before humans are human to the dawn of lunar communities. In other words, we're looking at the totality of the human experience, not linguistics or the society or the political or the economy. Rather, we're seeing it as a whole. The second is a malleable epistemology. Eric Wolf, who is a prominent US anthropologist, Eric Wolf once said, anthropology is the most scientific of the humanities and the most humane of the sciences. Again, breaking these kinds of division. The other is the engagement with the other. And this is one of the characteristics of anthropology in the American tradition, that anthropologists are directly dealing with the lived experience of the people they study. And in doing so, hierarchy requires distance, and in doing that we break down distance and we can work more closely. And then of course, cultural critique. One of the goals of anthropology is to make the exotic familiar and the familiar exotic. And I think this is a very profound idea. Also then, of course, is the idea of field work. Actually being out and engaging directly with what we're doing and not sitting around and reading about it. There is no sacred cow that anthropologists have not butchered, and I think anthropologists delight in disrupting, troubling, and changing taken for granted assumptions about the world. Now I want to focus on two pieces of work from my, projects from my own work, one of which Alfredo actually mentioned, which is the Ludlow Massacre study, and the other is a materiality study of the border, the materiality of the US-Mexican border. So, first of all, Colorado Coalfield War. One of our main goals in our study of the Colorado Goldfield War is to confront one of the greatest lies of capitalism. And that is the idea that that capitalism gives rights to workers, that rights are a gift from capitalists to workers. And this, of course, is not true. Workers won rights from blood. And we see this in the example of the Colorado Coalfield War of 1914. And this was a mining area in southern Colorado. The miners went out on strike, and they set up tent camps because they lived in company-owned housing. Therefore, as soon as they went out on strike, they were, ejected from their homes, and the union set up a tent camp for them. The largest of these tent camps was a place called Ludlow, and it housed about 800 to 900 people. They had tents. They also had dug trenches under pits under the tents. The purpose of these pits was to store things. It was also to seek refuge whenever bullets were fired. The strike was violent almost from the very beginning. In fact, actually, the first person was killed the second day of the strike. And as the strike violence increased, the governor of Colorado called out the Colorado militia, the Colorado National Guard, and sent them to the field to keep order. By April 20th, even the presence of the Guard had become problematic. The Guard had been infiltrated by company thugs, by people that were working for the companies. And on April 20th, 1914, fighting broke out. It's not clear who fired the first shot, as often is the case in these kinds of incidents. But the strikers were armed with carbines and rifles. The National Guard had 2 machine guns and 400 guardsmen armed with military weapons. The firing began early in the morning. It continued throughout the day. As it came to the close of the day, the strikers ran out of ammunition, and the armed strikers withdrew, and the National Guard swept into the tent camp and began burning the tents. In the burning of the tents, under one tent were 2 women, 2 women and 11 children. One of the women and all 11 of the children died of suffocation. 1 woman survived. There then was an outpouring of support for the strikers, and basically there was 10 days of class warfare until finally federal troops were sent in to put down the strike, which they did. From 1996 to 2006, we conducted excavations at the site. The burning of the tent camp, this is a theme that's come up in a couple of other talks. The burning of the tent camp essentially created the perfect archaeological site, a short-term occupation destroyed by fire. I mean, that's what we want, right? One of the questions earlier was, why are we always studying these catastrophic things? It's because it's what leaves the best archaeological remains, in part. And so we went in there and we asked archaeological questions. We asked questions about gender relations in the sites. In the strike, there was a kind of common belief in the analysis of strikes and class consciousness among American workers, that class consciousness was something formed in the workplace by men, and the fact was that what women did in the home reinforced ethnicity and ethnic identification, and that this then worked against the formation of class consciousness. Whereas what we demonstrated is that the lives of women were also structured by their class position, and that was also a source of class consciousness, for example. We did the project in collaboration with the United Mine Workers of the United Mine Workers International. This is the major union which is that covers coal miners in the United States. We had some of the miners would of course come out and see what we were doing, but we also set up a program where we tried to reach 2 audiences with education, an issue that's also already come up at this meeting. And one was we went to, there was a steel mill near the area we were working, and the steel workers went out on strike while we were in the field. And one of the things we did on several occasions, I addressed striking steel workers talking about archaeology. I think this is something not many of us ever get to do. But I got to do it, and it worked because I was talking about something that was relevant to them, something that was part of their life, something that they had an inherent interest into. We also developed programs to educate broader publics. We developed an interpretive program on the site of the massacre, which is property of the UMW. The UMW owns the massacre site. And we also set up education programs that teachers could use in the Denver, Colorado schools. So we did a number of things to try to expand this. I might add that I am a union member, and one of the things that facilitated me being able, or us being able to communicate with union people was that I could go into a union hall, I could stand as I'm standing before you now and begin my talk by saying, I greet you as a brother in the AFL-CIO. In other words, having that shared experience. Our work occurs at a time when there are a lot of issues related to unions in the United States, also during a time when there's a lot of anti-union sentiment. Oops, too many. And there was a memorial that the union had put up in 1918, and in 2003 somebody took a sledgehammer and beheaded the figures on the memorial, which was taken as an anti-union act. The memorial money was raised, and the memorial was restored in 2005. Now the second example I want to talk about is a work that I and my wife, Ruth Van Dyke, has done on the U.S.-Mexican border. The U.S.-Mexican border is about 3,000 kilometers long, roughly. And we were working in a place called Nogales, Ambos Nogales, which is Nogales, Sonora, Nogales, Arizona. Which is right there. There's the place where we're working. And what we were doing, the work, in the case of the Colorado Coalfield War, we had an archaeological project that was set up with a very definite political agenda. In other words, we set it up answering political questions. In this case, well, this is just to give you an idea of what the border looks like, what the border country looks like. It is desert. And since 1996, over 5,000 people have died crossing the U.S.-Mexican border because of the desert. Now, this is a number that pales in comparison with the number of people dying in the Mediterranean, but it's still far, far too many. Yeah, these are body bags in the coroner's office in Tucson, Arizona, of dead migrants. Our involvement in the border did not begin from archaeology or looking for a political project for archaeology. It began from doing political work, doing humanitarian aid work. We work with a group called No More Deaths, No Más Muertes. And what this group does, the primary thing this group does is put water out in the desert, put jugs of water out in the desert. We also run an aid station for deportees in Sonora, Mexico. The U.S. government will deport people to Mexico like at 2 or 3 in the morning. They basically take them across the border and dump them in Nogales, Sonora, which is not a safe place at 2 or 3 in the morning, etc. And so we were working in an aid station to help these people. And as we worked in that aid station, we became aware of what was happening. The border wall that was there changed, and we became aware that this was a change of materiality that would be where it would be useful to do archaeological analysis. So the archaeology in this case followed the politics; it didn't lead the politics. We engaged in doing a number of things which would be identified with contemporary archaeology, such as Alfredo was talking about. We treated the border as an archaeological assemblage. We looked at the different parts, how the walls were constructed, how walls related to surveillance, how walls related to vehicles, how all of these material things related. We looked at it as a dynamic thing with a life history. In other words, the materiality of the border is something that's changed over time. And really, we were not asking questions about migrants. In the archaeological analysis, we were asking questions about how a notion of community was being maintained, transformed between the two Nogaleses, between the Mexican community and the US community, which is identified as a joint community. They talk about how the border is a picket fence between neighbors. It is an association point of neighbors. We also looked at how did the wall both restrict and enable agency? How did changing the border, the materiality of the border, how did that affect what people could do or not do? And then also equally important, states materialize borders in order to control them and to control what people do. People often then do, as is happening right now in the United States and on this border, people often do things the state does not expect that uses the borders in ways that are not intended. One important point to make here is that there's also a tendency, very much in the United States, and I suspect also here in Europe, to see borders as hard-bounded things that divide people. People who live on borders do not see them that way. People who live on borders see borders as something to be crossed, as something that maintains their life and their relationships in the world. And so this was our focus. This just gives you some ideas of changes in the materiality of the border. This is the original, this is an early border. As you can see, it's just a row of stakes, just marking a line. For more than 50 years, the border was a chain link fence. And this is entries in the 1960s when the border was rebuilt by Mexico and the United States to encourage cross-border trade, cross-border contact, and internationalism. This attitude would change as we moved into the 1990s. And in 1994, the US government introduced a policy which is called prevention through deterrence. Before this time, they had concentrated on capturing people who crossed the border without documents inside the United States. And so at this point in time, it was decided to build walls in cities like Nogales, Tijuana, San Diego, El Paso, Juarez, etc. And the idea of these walls was to force people out into the desert so that they couldn't cross in the cities. And there were two logics to this. The first was when somebody crossed into the city, into a city, they could quickly disappear. In other words, the populations, there's lots of Mexican Americans. Someone who comes in from Mexico could quickly disappear in a border city without any problem. So that was one. The idea is they'd be easier to catch if you force them out into the border. The second idea was that by forcing people out into the desert, that what you were doing is you were putting them at risk of death. And that therefore, the idea was fewer people would try to do this. Now, when I say that the policy was to put people at risk of death, this is not my interpretation. The stated policy says that in almost that many words. In other words, this is not something. And this is when people start to die. This is when we start to, the number of people dying on the US-Mexican border is usually 300 to 400 a year. Again, this is a number that pales in comparison to the Mediterranean, but still is far, far too high. They brought in and built a new wall, or built a wall. There had not been a wall there before. And this wall was built out of surplus landing mats, steel mats that had been used in Vietnam to make kind of fly-by-night airstrips. And there was a lot of those surplus, so they put those up to create the wall. There was a lot of complaint from Nogales that the mats were very ugly. See what they look like up there. And as a consequence, for 1 mile in the downtown area, they built a decorative wall. That sign says in Spanish to deport the immigration, or deport the border patrol. Now, this wall stood for quite a while, and it had some of the desired effect. It could be climbed fairly easily if somebody was young and spry, but a lot of people lost fingers on it because of the sharp metal edges. The Border Patrol didn't like it because they could not see what was happening on the other side. So in 2011, they constructed a new border wall, which was what's referred to, called a bollard-style wall. This is we're in the United States looking in Mexico. That bus is in Mexico. So you can see it has slats with it. And here you can see it again. Now, this is very much a paradox because the U.S.-Mexican border is one of the most commercially crossed borders in the world. And also, over 10 million people a day cross the border with documents, not illegal. So these bars prevented some things and allowed others. One thing that the bars with the slots in them allows is that it has allowed American border agents to fire through the wall to the Mexican side, in one case killing a 14-year-old boy, who they said was throwing rocks at them. I cannot tell you what would happen if a Mexican border agent killed an American citizen on the American side. But nothing much happened with this case. So we're looking at how, what things does material culture enable? What things does it restrict? And as of last year, with our midterm elections in 2018, President Trump came up with a trumped-up excuse and a trumped-up idea that there were a bunch of migrants who were going to invade the United States. And so on the election day, this concertina wire was hung on the border, and it's still there. If you go there today, that's what you see. And of course, we can do a much more in-depth analysis of what's going on there, but I am running out of time. And the important point in terms of the idea of community, as I said, the people of Nogales see the two cities as one community. And one of the things that they have a long tradition of is cooperation between the two fire departments. And here you see them working around the wall in that case. The fire engine with the ladder and the hose are in the United States. The fire is burning in Mexico, and they are extending the ladder over the border to fight the fire in Mexico. They also are running hoses through the border wall to fight the fire. So anyway, okay, so that's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Рэндалл. Please, questions? Excited with this.
I think everybody wants coffee.
This extraordinary, unexpected this topic and the approach is not easy. Please.
You were talking about your tradition in America about anthropology, and you were talking about your toys, for documentation on the excavations and so on. So, I mean, in this dialogue between anthropologists and archaeology, anthropology, I mean, the documentation of anthropological records, I mean, they depend quite a lot on the oral record or living there in the villages, and I tell my neighbor or the anthropologist that I'm a very brave person and he believes me. Or that I have...
Only naive anthropologists would believe you're a very great person.
I know. But the question is a little bit, okay, there is no, or at least I don't know, a proper anthropological or ethnographical documentation, for example, of a village. The amount of burials there, the amount of monuments there, the size of the houses. But I know the stories made up by the anthropologists about the living there from the oral tradition. So my question to you would be in the perspective of the 21st century. The ethnographic research is it not also profiting from archaeology? So
Oh, again, yes,
so
absolutely.
it's much easier now to use archaeological methods to come up with some ideas what's right in the oral opinions which are transferred to the ethnographers, and what's wrong, because...
Well, I would find your characterization of the anthropological method a bit...
Overdone, I know.
Underdone, actually.
Well, underdone, but
yes.
Nevertheless...
I think that there is a lot of room for cooperation between archaeology and, cultural anthropology. For me, the important thing is what I refer to as thinking like an anthropologist. My degree, I have a doctorate in anthropology. I do not have a doctorate in archaeology or history. My doctorate is in anthropology. And what makes me different than a cultural anthropologist in my mind is the craft of archaeology. The toys, the knowledge, etc. that we put into playing. But the questions we ask, the answers we can come up with, the way we think about the world is not necessarily different. And that's when I was talking about holism and cultural critique and those things. Those are all ideas that I share with the cultural anthropologists in my department.
Please.
I understand Johan's point. When I read ethnography, sometimes I have this impression of irreality that I really don't know where these stories, sometimes the ethnographic account fails to capture the environment, the atmosphere, the place where the story is happening. So it seems that it's happening, the ethnographic description could be based in Russia, in Spain, or in Morocco. That there are many things that don't matter. So I think that I agree with you that we can have the same questions with anthropologists when it comes to society, to understand society. But I think that materiality, landscape things, these are important things that they are
Well, obviously I do too, that's why I'm an archaeologist.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but I understand that, as Johannes was saying, that maybe we can contribute by bringing these things into the picture that are sometimes forgotten by ethnographers.
Yes.
Like
yes.
in your account, I mean, the way you deal with the water is a material thing.
Yes. And I have found cultural anthropologists that I can work very closely with on the border. There's 2 or 3. There's also a couple I've been unable to work with because they don't recognize what I'm doing as having value. So, but that varies.
So, please, Sabina, one more question, and we are a bit out of time. So I propose that we have one more question. And later, we will have the possibility to make the discussion. The time for discussion is reserved in the second part of our meeting, so we have time for discussion. But now, maybe one question more, and we go to the coffee break.
I will keep it short. Well, in the first part of your talk, you asked the question, archaeology for whom? And in the second part, you showed 2 examples for whom, but that is certainly, I'm quite sure, not the mainstream interest in archaeology also in the United States. So would a task for the archaeology of the 21st century be to focus on not mainstream ideas, so leaving the gold, leaving the nice objects in the Metropolitan Museum, showing the heights of civilization, and focusing on the real world? Would that be the task?
I would say yes. In the United States, the idea of doing a community archaeology, where you identify your archaeology with a living community, is actually quite widespread. It is not it's an idea that starts probably, I'd say, in the 90s, early 90s. Certainly our project at Ludlow is sometimes, as Alfredo did, is sometimes identified as an early project doing that. But the idea that that's what we're supposed to be doing is very widespread and might even be the mainstream now in U.S. archaeology. And in part of that's because most of our archaeology is working with indigenous people who we took the continent from. But that's another paper and another discussion.
So thank you again for this wonderful presentation. And we come back here after 20 minutes. So we have 20 minutes for a coffee break.